Hi there, welcome to my YouTube channel Dhyani classes. If you're watching my video for the first time, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So in today's video we'll cover the chapter The Address, written by Marga Minko from class 11 CBSE. So let's get started. So this chapter, The Address, talks about a girl who went her native place after the war in search of her mother's belonging after her mother's death. She rings the bell of the house in search of Mrs. Darling, who was an old acquaintance of her mother. So this lesson also talks about the difficult situations that people faced during the war. And during the war, one of her mother's friends came to her house and advised her to keep all the valuable items safe by taking them away from her house. So she took out all the items and now the narrator wanted to get them back because she missed a lot of those things because all these items belonged to her mother and now she wanted to forget all these things. So let's see how she decided to forget them in the story, in the address. So let's begin with the first part of the chapter with line by line explanation in English. Do you still know me? I asked. The woman looked at me searchingly. So here the narrator is saying that, do you still know me? I asked. So who is I here? The narrator is I here, and she is the daughter of Mrs. SS, and she went to somebody's house to identify the address that was given by her mother. So she knocks on the door and asks, do you still know me? And says, the woman looked at me searchingly. That means the woman who opened the door looked at the narrator when she asked, do you know me? And then the landlady or the owner of the house looked at the narrator very strangely because she did not recognize the narrator. So searchingly means examining closely or looking at someone doubtfully, and says she had opened the door a chink. So the landlady opened the gate a little bit but not fully or widely open because she did not recognize the narrator, and says, I came closer and stood on the step. No, I don't know you. So when the narrator saw the landlady who opened the gate very little, immediately she came closer to her so that the landlady could take a better look, and then says, no, I don't know you. So the landlady was not able to identify her, who knocked the door and said, I'm sorry, I don't know you, and who are you? And says, I'm Mrs. S.'s daughter. So the narrator, the girl, told the landlady that I am Mrs. S.'s daughter. So here we can see the narrator was Mrs. S.'s daughter, and she wanted to find out the house where her mother left belonging before the war. So in this way she told the landlady that I am her daughter, and also wanted to make that lady understand who she is, and says she held her hand on the door as though she wanted to prevent it opening any further. So as the girl came closer to the landlady just in front of the door, immediately she held her hand on the door. That means the landlady held her hand near the door, and the girl felt that though she wanted to prevent it from opening any further. That means the landlady felt that the girl would enter inside the house, and she wanted to close the door once the girl would enter or approach inside the house. So she doesn't want the girl to enter, so she held her hand near the door to prevent her. Further she says her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. So here the narrator is saying that her face gave absolutely no sign of recognition. That means the owner of the house did not even understand who is standing outside and who is she, and even the girl told the name of her mother, but the lady couldn't recognize her at that time and kept a close watch on the girl, and says she kept staring at me in silence. Perhaps I was mistaken, I thought. So the girl saw that the landlady kept staring at her in silence. That means she was continuously staring at the girl because she was not able to recognize her, and then the girl thought, perhaps I was mistaken. That means she thought maybe she came to the wrong address because there was no sign of recognition on the face of the landlady, and says perhaps it isn't her. So she thought maybe she is not the one to whom her mother told her and gave her address, and says I had seen her only once, fleetingly, and that was years ago. So the narrator is saying that I had seen her only once, fleetingly. That means the girl once had seen her for short time, and that was a year ago. So she saw her that 2 years ago, and that's why she was not able to recognize the girl. So what do you mean by fleetingly? That means for a very short time or not for long time. And then the narrator thought it was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. So finally the narrator, the girl, that was most probable that I had rung the wrong bell. That means she thought she approached the wrong address or have gone wrong address and rung the wrong bell. The woman let go of the door and stepped to the side. So here the narrator is saying that the woman let go of the door. That means she came out from the door where she was standing and stepped to the side. That means the landlady came closer to the girl because she saw something very strange. So what was the strange there? She was wearing my mother's green knitted cardigan. So the girl was wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan. That means the girl was wearing her mother's knitted sweater or long sleeves. And the landlady also saw the wooden buttons were rather pale from washing. So whatever the girl was wearing belonged to her mother, and the owner of the house staring the dress very closely, and she also saw wooden buttons on the cardigans which the girl was wearing. And seeing all this, the landlady was able to recognize the clothes she wore because she knew that it was her mother's green cardigan, and the wooden button on it and also buttons were pale from washing. That means buttons were slightly toned, and says she was that I was looking at the cardigan and half hid herself again behind the door. So the owner of the house or landlady who came out of the house understood that girl understood that I am staring at her cardigan. So immediately she half hidden herself again behind the door. That means she went back to the door of the house and started trying to cover herself because she knew that the girl had understood that it was her mother's clothes that she was wearing at that time. Further she says, but I knew now that I was right. Well, you know my mother, I asked. So the owner of the house understood that the girl has come to the right address because she recognized the dress, and then she asked her that, well, you know my mother. That means she wanted to know as if she knew her mother because she was wearing her mother's knitted cardigan. So in this way she understood. She rang the bell of the right house and says, have you come back? Said the woman. I thought that no one had come back, only me. So the owner of the house said, have you come back? The lady said that you have come back. That means the lady wanted to know more about the people along with her and says, I thought that one had back, only me. That means that at that time the girl was all alone and looking for the address given by her mother, and said, no, one had come back and I am the only one who came here. And says, a door opened and closed in the passage behind her. So during the conversation, the girl heard a noise and it was a door opening and closing in the passage behind her. That means there was a noise coming inside of the house and somebody is opening and closing the door constantly, and says a musty smell emerged. So there was a smell also coming out of the house. So what do you mean by musty smell? That means a smell from a dumping place. So that kind of smell came outside suddenly, and says, I regret I cannot do anything for you. So the owner of the house told the girl that I regret I cannot do anything for you. That means I'm sorry, I'm not able to help you out to find out the address, because she knew that the girl has come to the right address. I've come here especially on the train. I wanted to talk to you for a moment. So here she is saying that as soon as the landlady told her that I am sorry I can't help you, then immediately she said, I have come here especially on the train. That means the girl told her that I came here especially to meet you and I came by train, and says I wanted to talk to you for a moment. So the girl requested the landlady that she wanted to talk to her for a moment, and says, it is not convenient for me, said the woman. So the landlady told her that it is not convenient for me now. That means I can't meet you because I am not comfortable right now to talk to you anything. So the landlady already knew why the girl came here and why she wanted to talk to her, and says, I can't see you another time. So she also told her that I can't see you. That means he didn't want to meet her or to talk to her. So she told her that to come back another time and then I will talk to you, but for this time I'm not really comfortable to talk to you. And says she nodded and cautiously closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. So after that the landlady nodded and cautiously closed the door. That means she nodded her head by saying see you again, and very carefully she closed the door as though no one inside the house should be disturbed. So she closed the door very silently, and the girl felt that someone is inside the house, and that's why she is closing the door very carefully and silently. Further she says, I stood where I was on the step. The curtain in front of the bay window moved. So here the girl did not move from in front of the house, as the landlady closed the door and says the curtain in front of the bay window moved. That means she saw somebody from house looked at her through the window and says someone stared at me and would then have asked what I wanted. So as she saw the curtain in front of the bay window moved and somebody from inside had looked at her through the window, and she felt that the person might have also asked the lady who is there outside and what she wanted, and says, "Oh, nothing," the woman would have said, "It was nothing." So the girl understood that somebody or someone from inside the house is asking the owner of the house that who is there outside, and the lady said, "Oh, nothing." That means nobody is there. And then the girl became very surprised because the landlady told her it was nothing. That means she wanted to say nobody is there outside, and says, "I looked at nameplate again." So the girl looked at the nameplate again. That means she wanted to make sure whether she came to correct address or not. And then again she looked at the nameplate of the owner of the house and said, "Darling," it said in black letter on white enamel. So she looked at the nameplate and it was written in black bold letter, "Darling," on white enamel. So this is what she wanted to make sure whether she approached the correct address. On the jam a bit higher, the number 46. So here the girl also noticed a post which was a bit higher in height, and in that the address was also there, and it was written in number 46 and says, "As I walked slowly back to the station, I thought about my mother who had given me the address years ago." So the girl was sure that she approached the right address, and then she walked slowly back to the station. That means she decided to go back to the station, and while going back she was thinking about her mother who had given her address years ago. So now she understood that the given address is correct and it was given to her mother by some years ago, and says, "It had been in the first half of the war. I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately that something or other about the room had changed." So here she is talking about the first half of the war, that she had been living in that place where she went to know more about the address, and says, "I was home for a few days and it struck me immediately." That means she remembers suddenly that something or other about the room had changed. So she is talking about the past when war was going on, and it was during the first half of the war. So maybe she went outside for studies or something, and then she had come back for holidays, and then she noticed something about her house and it was very different. Further she says, "I missed various things. My mother was surprised I should have noticed so quickly." So here she is saying that I missed various things. That means when she came back to her house, she was able to notice that many things missed from her house, and asked her mother about missed various things, and says, "My mother was surprised I should have noticed so quickly." So whatever the girl noticed, she explained everything her mother and told her that there were many things or other things were missing from the house. And when she asked about these things, her mother became very surprised that how this girl was able to identify various things that were missing from the house, and says, "Then she told me about Mrs. Darling." So later on her mother told her about Mrs. Darling, and it was the first time when she heard something about Mrs. Darling from her mother, and it was the time when second phase of the war was going on, and says, "I had never heard of her, but apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother whom she hadn't seen for years." So the girl was thinking about her mother and Mrs. Darling when she was going back home, and her mother also told her that I had never heard of her. That means her mother hardly met Mrs. Darling and she was not very close to her, but she knew her, and says, "But apparently she was an old acquaintance of my mother." So Mrs. Darling was her mother's friend, but they were not very close friend and whom she hadn't seen for years. So her mother was not really familiar with Mrs. Darling and hadn't seen her for many years. She had suddenly turned up and renewed their contact. So here she is talking about Mrs. Darling, that all of a sudden she had come to her mother's house after many years, and she came there to meet her mother just because of renewed their contact. That means again she wanted to be her mother's best friend, and says since then she had come regularly. So after that Mrs. Darling used to visit her house regularly or without any invitation, and she was a regular visitor to their house, and says, "Every time she leaves here and she takes something home with her," said my mother. So Mrs. Darling used to visit her house, and every time she lives here, that means she used to spend few days in her house as a guest, and then when she goes back to her house, she takes something home with her. So her mother told that Mrs. Darling used to take something from her house, and says she took all the table silver in one go, and then in antique plate that hung there. So she told her daughter that Mrs. Darling took all the table silver in one go. That means she took all the silver spoons, knives, or other kitchen appliances, and then the antique plates that hung there. So Mrs. Darling also took an expensive or decorative plates from her house that were hung there, because all the plates were very beautiful and old decorative plates, and all these antique plates and table silver she used to take from her house. Further, she says she had trouble lugging those large vessels, and I am worried she got a crick in her back from the crockery. So here the narrator is saying that she had trouble lugging those large vessels. That means her mother was telling her daughter that Mrs. Darling had trouble in carrying large vessels. That means large flower containers made of wooden or glass. So she was not able to carry these heavy containers, and says, I am worried she got a crick in her back from the crockery. So the mother was worried because Mrs. Darling was carrying heavy weight, and felt that the lady might have got a strain on her back while pulling these heavy crockeries. So what do you mean by lugging? That means carrying something with great difficulties, and says, my mother shook her head pityingly. So her mother was looking at Mrs. Darling when she was pulling all these items from her house, and shook her head pityingly. That means she was feeling very sad because she was helping Mrs. Darling by carrying all the heavy belongings out of the house, and says, I would never have dared ask her. She suggested it to me herself. So here the mother was feeling very sad because things were very heavy, and she was feeling difficulty in pulling these things out of the house. And the mother was telling her daughter that I would never have dared to ask her. That means she never asked her to stop pulling all these items, because she suggested it to me herself. That means Mrs. Darling suggested her mother to take out all these valuable items out of the house because of the war was going on at that time. So in this way her mother never wanted to ask her, and says she even insisted she wanted to save all my things. So this was the suggestion given by Mrs. Darling to keep all these valuable items safe, and then she took out of these items out of the house because Mrs. Darling wanted to save all my nice things. So the mother also told her daughter that she wanted to save all the valuable things from her house, and wanted to take out all these belongings to her house. If we have to leave here, we shall lose everything, she says. So Mrs. Darling also suggested the mother that if we have to leave here, we shall lose everything. That means she told her that we should remove all the valuable things out of the house because the war is going on, and we might get lost or things might get stolen from the house, and told the mother that I will keep your valuable things safe. And then she started carrying items out of the house. So Mrs. Darling used to visit her house regularly, and she used to carry valuable items out of the house. So this was the suggestion given by Mrs. Darling, and this is what she told her daughter. And then immediately the girl asked, have you agreed with her that she should keep everything I asked? So the girl immediately asked her mother, have you agreed with her? That means whatever suggestion given by Mrs. Darling, have you agreed with her, and how do you know she should keep everything safe? So the girl was quite frightened, and says, as if that is necessary, my mother cried. So the mother told her daughter that at that time it was very important to keep everything safe, and that's why I was not able to say anything to Mrs. Darling about why and where she is carrying all the valuable items from the house, because she was doing something good for us, and says it would simply be an insult to talk like that. So the mother also told her that it would simply be insult. That means if she asked her any question about carrying all the valuable things, it would be insulting because she was doing something in keeping things safe. And says, and think about the risk she is running each time she goes out of our door with a full suitcase or bag. So as per the mother, Mrs. Darling was taking risk in carrying expensive item all alone because of the war was going on, and each time she goes out of our doors with full of suitcase or bag. So Mrs. Darling used to visit her house with a bag, suitcase or big bag, and then goes out of the door and then carried a big suitcase full of belonging which was heavy in weight. So the mother felt that she is taking risk by keeping our valuable things safely. So in this way, her mother used to support her because she thought she was trying to help her. Further, she says, my mother seemed to notice that I was not entirely convinced. So the girl was not satisfied at all, and her mother understood that the girl was not really convinced whatever she explained to her, because she was worried as the Mrs. Darling was taking away all the valuable item out of the house whenever she used to visit her house, and says, she looked at me reprovingly, and after that we spoke no more about it. So the mother looked at me reprovingly. That means she was trying to convince her daughter again, and after that we spoke no more about it. That means from that day onwards, they never had any conversation about Mrs. Darling or taking away valuable things out of the house. And says, meanwhile, I had arrived at the station without having paid much attention to things on the way. So finally the girl reached the station, and while walking, these thoughts were coming in her mind, all about Mrs. Darling and all about the valuable things. So this is the end of the first part of the chapter, the address. Let's look at the second part of the chapter in my next video. For more informative videos, do subscribe my channel, hit the bell icon so that you get notified whenever new video will be uploaded. So thank you so much for watching once again. Stay safe, stay healthy.